There is a moment in the ministry of exorcism that no one ever truly prepares you for. It is not the physical violence in the room, not the sudden changes in atmosphere, not even the unsettling phenomena that people often imagine when they think about possession. Those elements, as intense as they are, can be mentally cataloged beforehand from the written accounts of earlier priests or from years of theological study. You can anticipate them in theory, even if the reality of the experience still overwhelms you when it actually arrives. But there is another moment entirely, something far more difficult to process, that cannot be prepared for in the same way. It happened during one of the most severe cases of possession I have ever encountered in my years of ministry. The individual had been in a long and deeply progressive state of oppression that we later understood had developed over years before it fully manifested. By the time we reached the critical stages of the rite, the room had already passed through conditions that I have described elsewhere. The kind of changes in atmosphere, perception, and physical reaction that mark the escalation of such cases. We were well into the rite, and the presence we were dealing with had already been forced, through sustained prayer and authority, into a state where it was compelled to respond directly. What happened next was not what most people would expect from such a confrontation. The entity did not respond with threats or attempts at intimidation, which are common in these moments. It did not try to provoke fear through predictions or personal accusations. Instead, there was a pause, a moment of stillness that carried an unusual weight, and then it spoke in a tone that was not chaotic or fragmented, but disturbingly controlled. What it said carried a sense of contempt so clear that it immediately changed the atmosphere of the entire room. It began to describe hell, not as something distant or abstract, not as a warning meant to frighten or deter, but in a way that suggested familiarity. It spoke of it as someone might speak of a place they had lived in for a very long time, with a kind of cold recognition and intimate knowledge, stripped of emotion, stripped of fear, almost casual in its certainty. The description it gave was not aligned with anything any of us had ever imagined in simplistic terms, and it created a silence in the room that lasted far longer than the words themselves. I want to be clear from the beginning that what I am describing is not a story meant for entertainment or fear. It is not presented as religious drama or symbolic imagery. It is a consolidation of experiences gathered over more than 2 decades of work in exorcism ministry, combined with the theological tradition of the Church and the patterns that emerge when these encounters are compared across time and cases. There are moments in this work where theology, lived experience, and compelled disclosures from the rite intersect in ways that are difficult to dismiss or reduce. What I am sharing comes from that intersection, and I do not present it lightly or without reflection. My name is Chad Ripper. I am a Catholic priest, trained in theology and philosophy, and authorized to serve in exorcism ministry. I did not enter this subject out of curiosity or fascination with the unusual. I entered it because over time, in the course of pastoral work, I encountered situations that required a deeper engagement with realities that most people rarely confront directly. In those encounters, I have seen enough to know that dismissing everything as metaphor or imagination does not account for what consistently appears across different cases and contexts. What follows is not intended to sensationalize, but to confront directly what the tradition teaches, what the lived experience confirms in fragments, and what the moments of compelled speech during the rite sometimes reveal, when every layer of deception is pressed down by authority greater than the entity itself. What I am asking you to do now is to stay with this carefully, because what comes next is not added for effect or emphasis. It is necessary for understanding why the experience I described earlier carries the weight that it does. The discussion must move from that moment in the exorcism room into something deeper and more structured, because without the framework of the Church's actual teaching, what happened there can easily be misunderstood or dismissed, and that would miss the point entirely. When I speak about hell in this context, I am not referring to popular images or cultural interpretations. I am not referring to artistic depictions that have evolved over centuries, nor modern attempts to reduce the concept into something purely symbolic or psychological. I am referring to the formal theological understanding that has been developed, refined, and preserved within the Catholic tradition over centuries of reflection, debate, and lived spiritual experience. In that tradition, hell is not treated as a metaphor for emotional suffering or alienation. It is treated as an objective reality, a definitive state that follows from the final condition of the soul at the moment of death. These are not poetic descriptions, but conceptual distinctions meant to describe different aspects of the same reality. The first is what is called the pain of loss. This refers to the permanent absence of the beatific vision, which is understood as the direct and immediate knowledge of God. In theological terms, this vision is not an external reward added onto existence, but the ultimate fulfillment of the human soul itself. It is what the soul is ordered toward by its nature. To lose it permanently is therefore not simply to lose something desirable, but to lose the very end for which existence was oriented. This loss is not experienced as neutrality or emptiness in the way human beings typically understand absence. It is described in the tradition as a positive deprivation, something that is known and perceived with full clarity by the intellect of the soul. The soul does not forget what it has lost. It does not adjust or adapt to its condition in a way that reduces awareness of that loss. Instead, it exists in a state where the full truth of what is missing is permanently present to consciousness. This is what gives the pain its intensity. It is not ignorance that produces suffering, but clarity without the possibility of resolution. Alongside this is what the tradition calls the pain of sense. This refers to a different dimension of suffering, one that involves real experience beyond the purely intellectual or spiritual awareness of loss. While the exact nature of this suffering is described in analogical language, since human experience has no perfect categories for it, it is nonetheless presented as something real rather than symbolic. The tradition maintains that the soul, in its disordered state, experiences a form of suffering appropriate to its condition, and that this suffering is not merely internalized regret or psychological distress, but a real participation in consequences that extend beyond ordinary human categories of experience. What is often missed in modern interpretations is not simply the content of these teachings, but their structure. Hell, in this understanding, is not arbitrary punishment imposed from the outside. It is the final confirmation of a freely chosen orientation. It is the state that results when the will becomes permanently fixed in rejection of the source of its own fulfillment. This is why the tradition insists so strongly on the permanence of the condition. It is not that mercy ceases to exist, but that the soul, in that final state, is no longer capable of receiving it in the way it was once able to. Modern culture often struggles with this framework because it has difficulty holding together two ideas at the same time. The first is the infinite mercy of God, and the second is the real consequence of human freedom. In attempting to resolve this tension, there is a tendency to soften one side until the structure collapses into something more comfortable. Mercy becomes understood as the automatic cancellation of consequences, while justice is reduced to a temporary corrective measure. But within the traditional framework, mercy and justice are not opposed, and neither eliminates the other. Instead, they operate within a single coherent reality in which human freedom is taken with absolute seriousness. This is the background against which the exorcism experience I described earlier must be understood, because when something within that context speaks of these realities with familiarity, not as speculation but as something recognized, it forces a confrontation between abstract belief and something that presents itself as direct knowledge. The Church does not base its teaching on such experiences, and it is careful not to do so. But it also does not require that every aspect of spiritual reality be accessible through ordinary human reasoning alone. There are layers of tradition, theological reasoning, and mystical testimony that together form a broader picture than any single source can provide. And it is within that broader picture that the seriousness of what follows becomes clear. Because once these teachings are understood in their proper structure, the question is no longer whether they are emotionally comfortable or culturally acceptable. The question becomes whether they correspond to a reality that operates independently of human preference. And that question, once it is seriously considered, changes the way everything else must be viewed. Now we need to move from doctrine into something more concrete, because theology on its own can still feel abstract unless it is placed under real pressure. And this is exactly where the tradition, personal experience, and the accounts gathered in exorcism ministry begin to converge in a way that is difficult to ignore. When the Church speaks about the particular judgment, it is describing something that happens at the exact moment of death, not as a delayed process or a gradual transition. The teaching is precise on this point. The soul does not enter confusion or unconsciousness. It does not drift into uncertainty. Instead, it enters a state of complete clarity that is no longer mediated by the limitations of the body. The intellect, no longer constrained by physical processes, perceives reality directly. And in that moment, according to the tradition, everything becomes known at once. the totality of one's life, every decision, every refusal of grace, every moment where truth was recognized and then rejected. This is not presented as an external accusation. It is not described as a courtroom scenario where evidence is introduced from outside the soul. Rather, it is understood as an interior illumination so complete that self-deception is no longer possible. The soul sees itself exactly as it is, without distortion, without justification, and without the psychological mechanisms that normally allow human beings to avoid the full weight of their own actions. And in that clarity, the judgment occurs. Not imposed from the outside, but recognized from within, with absolute lucidity. What follows from that moment is what the tradition describes as the fixed orientation of the soul. For those who are united with God, this clarity becomes the beginning of fulfillment. But for the soul that has definitively turned away, it becomes the beginning of an irreversible state of separation. Not because mercy is withdrawn in a reactive sense, but because the capacity to receive that mercy has already been freely adcast over the course of life, and is now fully confirmed in that final moment of understanding. This is where the concept of eternity in the tradition becomes important, because it does not simply refer to infinite duration. It refers to a qualitative state of existence that is no longer measured by change in the way human life is. In that sense, what begins at the moment of judgment is not a sequence of events in time, as we understand it, but a fixed condition in which the consequences of that final orientation are fully experienced without interruption or resolution. And this is also where the accounts that emerge in exorcism contexts become relevant, not as a foundation for doctrine, but as a disturbing point of contact with it. In certain rare and highly intense moments of the rite, when the entity is pressed beyond its usual patterns of resistance, fragments of description emerge that are not consistent with psychological explanation alone. They are not presented in symbolic language or in the form of metaphor. Instead, they are described in a way that suggests recognition, as though what is being spoken about is not imagined but known. What is particularly striking in these moments is not the emotional tone, which can vary, but the consistency of certain themes when such disclosures occur under compulsion. The absence of hope is described not as despair in the human sense, but as a structural feature of the condition itself. The sense of finality is not experienced as a fear of what might happen, but as the recognition that nothing else can happen. There is no movement toward resolution, no transition into something different, no reversal of the state. Everything is fixed in a way that makes change itself impossible. It is important to emphasize again that the Church does not build its teaching on these kinds of experiences. The theological structure stands independently on scripture, tradition, and philosophical reasoning. But when these different streams of understanding appear to converge on certain descriptions, it creates a situation where dismissal becomes less intellectually simple than it might first appear. And so the question that remains is not whether these ideas are emotionally acceptable, but whether they describe something real enough to demand attention. Because if they do, then they cannot simply be placed at the edge of belief as abstract possibilities. They must be considered as realities that shape the meaning of every present choice, even when those choices feel small or ordinary in the moment. Now we come to the part that moves beyond definition and into something more unsettling, because the tradition does not only speak about judgment and separation in abstract terms. It also attempts to describe what the beginning of that condition is like from the perspective of the soul that enters it. According to classical Catholic theology, the first experience after death is not confusion, delay, or gradual awareness. It is immediate understanding. The soul, freed from the limitations of the body, does not slowly discover its situation over time. It perceives it all at once. This includes full awareness of its life as a complete moral reality, not as isolated events, but as a unified whole. Every action, every omission, every moment of grace accepted or rejected becomes present to the intellect in a single act of knowledge. What matters here is not just memory, but clarity. In ordinary life, human beings remember selectively. We reinterpret. We justify. We forget what is too painful to hold at full intensity. But in this moment, according to the tradition, those protective layers no longer function. The soul sees without distortion. It sees what it did, but also what those actions meant in relation to truth, goodness, and the ultimate purpose of its existence. This is why the tradition speaks of judgment as something that is both revealed and self-recognized. It is not that God introduces something unknown to the soul. Rather, the soul comes to know itself in a way that was never fully possible during earthly life. The judgment is therefore experienced as truth becoming unavoidable, not as a verdict imposed from outside, but as a condition that is finally seen without any remaining resistance. From this point, the tradition describes a kind of fixed orientation that follows. For those aligned with God, this clarity becomes entry into fulfillment. For those who have definitively rejected that alignment, it becomes the confirmation of separation, not as an arbitrary exclusion, but as the completion of a freely formed trajectory that has now reached its final point. It is at this stage that language begins to struggle, because human experience has no perfect equivalent for a state that is unchanging in this way. When we think of consequences in ordinary life, we assume movement, development, or the possibility of correction. Even suffering in this world is temporary, in the sense that it unfolds within time and can be altered by new conditions. But the tradition insists that what follows death is not structured in the same way. It is not a sequence that unfolds and resolves. It is a settled state in which the consequences of one's final orientation are fully present without the possibility of revision. This is where descriptions from mystical sources, carefully treated within the Church's discernment, often attempt to express what that condition feels like. They do so in analogical language, because direct description is not fully possible. Yet across different accounts, certain patterns repeat. There is the sense of finality that is not simply intellectual but existential. There is awareness without relief, knowledge without transition, and experience without the possibility of change. In some of the more severe and unusual cases encountered in exorcism ministry, when compelled speech occurs under the authority of the rite, similar themes appear, though always in fragmented form. What is notable is not dramatic expression, but structural consistency. The condition is described in terms that emphasize absence of resolution, absence of relief, and absence of any horizon of change. Not as a moment of crisis, but as a state in which crisis itself has no endpoint. The Church is careful not to base doctrine on these phenomena, and rightly so. The foundation remains scripture, tradition, and reasoned theological reflection. But when lived experience, mystical testimony, and these rare compelled disclosures all point in similar directions, it becomes harder to treat the subject as purely symbolic or culturally constructed. At this point, the central issue is no longer whether the language is comfortable or whether the imagery is acceptable to modern sensibilities. The issue becomes whether the structure being described corresponds to a reality that exists independently of human preference. And if it does, then it reframes how every present moment is understood. Because what is at stake is not a distant abstraction, but the final shape of a life that is being formed continuously through present choices. Now we need to move from what happens after death into what actually leads there. Because the tradition is very clear that these outcomes are not random and not sudden in the sense people often imagine. They are the end result of interior patterns that are formed gradually over time, usually without dramatic awareness from the person living them. The Church identifies several dispositions of the soul that, when left unchecked, become spiritually dangerous precisely because they distort how a person relates to truth, grace, and moral responsibility. These are not understood as isolated mistakes or temporary moral failures, but as deeper orientations of the will that shape the direction of a life. One of the most significant of these is what the tradition calls presumption. This is not simple hope or trust in God's mercy. It is a misplacement of that trust. It is the assumption that mercy will override the actual condition of the soul regardless of how one lives, and that final reconciliation with God does not require real conversion, only the passage of time or the approach of death. In this mindset, moral urgency is weakened. The need for repentance is postponed indefinitely. The idea of consequences becomes abstract, something assumed to be resolved at the end without requiring any concrete change in the present. Closely related to this is what can be described as spiritual indifference or neglect, a state in which the soul does not actively reject the good, but gradually stops responding to it. In this condition, spiritual life is not denied, but it is slowly displaced. Other concerns become dominant, and what once carried moral weight begins to feel distant or optional. Over time, this leads to a kind of internal dullness, where the capacity to recognize urgency in spiritual matters weakens. The person does not feel as though they have turned away from God, but rather that their attention has simply shifted elsewhere until the relationship becomes secondary or symbolic rather than lived. This is the condition in which a person knowingly and repeatedly rejects what they recognize to be morally or spiritually true. It is not confusion, and it is not ignorance. It is a sustained pattern of refusal. Over time, this creates a hardening of the will, where the ability to respond differently becomes diminished, not by external force, but by repeated internal choice. In theological language, this is associated with the gradual closing of the soul to grace, not because grace is withdrawn, but because it is consistently refused. What is important in all of these cases is that the process is typically not experienced as dramatic. From the inside, these shifts often feel small, almost invisible. A delay in response here, a justification there, a gradual reordering of priorities that seems reasonable in isolation. But over time, these small movements accumulate into a direction, and it is that direction, rather than any single moment, that becomes decisive. This is why the tradition places such emphasis on awareness and vigilance. Not because every mistake is treated as catastrophic, but because the direction of the will is understood to be shaped by repeated responses over time. The concern is not isolated failure, but the normalization of distance from what is ultimately real and binding. When this is placed alongside the earlier teaching about judgment and the final state of the soul, a coherent structure emerges. The end is not disconnected from the beginning. It is the culmination of a trajectory that has been forming all along, often quietly and without dramatic recognition. The final state simply makes explicit what has already been taking shape internally. And this is also where the urgency in the tradition comes from. Not from fear as an emotional reaction, but from the understanding that the present moment is not neutral. It is formative. It is shaping something that will not remain indefinitely flexible. Every response to truth, every act of refusal or acceptance, contributes to a direction that is being established even now, whether consciously recognized or not.